The sailors of Carthage had a saying about the sea, that no Roman could wash his hands in it without their permission. In the summer of 256 BC, off a headland on the southern coast of Sicily called Cape Ecnomus, they had every reason to believe it. Their fleet that morning numbered around 350 warships, crewed by men whose families had worked oars and rigging for generations, heirs to a naval tradition stretching back through their Phoenician ancestors for centuries. Across the water sat the Roman fleet, roughly 330 ships, crewed largely by farmers, some of whom had learned to row on wooden benches set up in fields on dry land. The Carthaginian commanders looked at those ships and saw a slow, clumsy, badly handled fleet sailing straight into the jaws of the finest navy in the Mediterranean. What they could not see, or refuse to take seriously, was a strange wooden structure mounted on the bow of each Roman ship. A bridge, roughly 36 feet long, standing upright against a mast, with a heavy iron spike hanging beneath its far end like a beak. The Romans called it the corvus, the crow. Before the sun set on that stretch of water, that one device would help break the Carthaginian fleet, open the road to an invasion of Africa itself, and hand Rome a victory in what may have been, by the number of men involved, one of the largest naval battles ever fought in the ancient world. And then, within a few short years, Rome would take this weapon, the weapon that had won it everything, and quietly erase it from its own navy. Not because it failed in battle. It never failed in battle. Rome abandoned the corvus because of what it did to Rome's own ships, and that part of the story is the part almost nobody tells. So the question is worth asking slowly. How did a republic with no naval tradition at all build a fleet from nothing, bolt a bridge onto its bows, and destroy the greatest maritime power of the age in its own element? That is the story we are going to take apart today, piece by piece. First, how Rome built a war fleet from almost nothing, reportedly working from the template of a single wrecked enemy ship. Second, what the corvus actually was, plank by plank, pulley by pulley, and how a boarding bridge converted a sea battle into something no Carthaginian crew wanted any part of. Third, the formation Rome sailed into battle at Ecnomus, a wedge of ships arranged like an army on land, and the trap Carthage laid against it. Fourth, the battle itself, which was really 3 separate battles fought at the same time across miles of open water, each one nearly lost. And fifth, the fate of the corvus and of the consul who commanded that day, Marcus Atilius Regulus, whose name would become one of the darkest legends in Roman memory. Each of those 5 threads pays off the others, so stay with the sequence. One note on sources before we begin. Almost everything we know about this battle comes down through the Greek historian Polybius, writing about a century after the events, working in part from the earlier account of Philinus of Agrigentum, a historian sympathetic to Carthage, and from the pro-Roman Fabius Pictor, which means even our single main source is already a negotiation between 2 hostile traditions. Modern historians of the First Punic War, John Lazenby's study of the conflict among them, and G.K. Che, tips in a detailed article on Ecnomus itself, spend a great deal of effort testing his numbers and his geometry. Where the figures are his, I will say so, and where scholars doubt them, I will say that too. To understand why a fleet of farmers was anchored off southern Sicily at all, you have to go back 8 years to 264 BC. Rome and Carthage stumbled into war over the city of Messana on the northeastern tip of Sicily, a straitside town seized by a band of Italian mercenaries who called themselves the Mamertines, the Sons of Mars, and who managed to invite both powers to their rescue at once. A Roman consul, Appius Claudius Caudex, ferried his legions across the strait at night on borrowed and requisitioned vessels because Rome did not even own enough hulls to move its own army 3 miles over water. What began as a local dispute over one city hardened into a struggle for the whole island, especially after Hero II, the Greek king of Syracuse, read the wind and switched to the Roman side in 263, giving Rome a secure base and a grain supply on Sicilian soil. And on land, Rome did what Rome did. Its legions pushed across Sicily, took allies, took cities, spent 7 brutal months besieging and finally storming the great Carthaginian stronghold of Agrigentum in 2062 and pressed the Carthaginians back toward their fortified ports on the western coast. Then the advance stopped. It stopped because every one of those ports could be fed, paid, and reinforced by sea, and Rome had effectively no navy worth the name, a couple dozen small triremes and whatever its Greek-allied cities like Naples and Tarentum could lend. Carthaginian squadrons raided the Italian coast at will. Roman armies could win the field and still watch the war drift out of reach beyond the surf. The Roman Senate reached a conclusion that, for a nation of soldiers and farmers, bordered on the absurd. Rome would become a sea power immediately from a standing start. The tradition preserved in our ancient sources holds that the Romans used a captured Carthaginian warship, a quinquereme, that had run aground early in the war while chasing those first troop ferries across the strait, as a template, and copied it hull by hull. Understand what a quinquereme was because the word matters. Not 5 banks of oars, but 5 rowers in each vertical group, arranged across 2 or 3 levels, roughly 300 rowers to a ship, plus marines and deck crew. A wooden vessel some 140 feet long with a cast bronze ram at the waterline weighing hundreds of pounds. Polybius claims the Romans built 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes in about 60 days, and even records the detail of crews being trained to row on benches built on dry land, practicing the stroke in dust before they ever touched water, an entire rowing curriculum conducted in a field. Historians long treated the 60-day figure as patriotic exaggeration, and it may be, but the underwater archaeology of recent decades has made it less absurd than it sounds. The bronze warship rams recovered from the seabed off the Egadi Islands, the site of the war's final battle, turn out to be standardized, mass-produced castings, evidence that both sides were building warships the way a factory builds plows, from templates, in batches. What Rome could manufacture, though, it could not conjure, and what it did not have was a century of seamanship. A quinquereme fight in this era was won by maneuver, by the ram. A skilled crew would swing wide, spin the hull, and drive a bronze beak into an enemy's flank, or execute the pass the Greeks called the diplus, knifing through a gap in the enemy line to turn and strike from behind, or shear away an entire side's oars in a single grinding pass, leaving the victim spinning helplessly while the rowers inside were mangled by their own flailing looms. The Carthaginians were the finest practitioners of that art alive. Put the 2 fleets in open water on those terms and the Roman fleet was firewood. Somebody in Rome understood this with complete clarity because instead of trying to outsail Carthage, Rome changed the question. If Roman crews could not win a sea battle, then the sea battle would have to become a land battle. And in 260 BC, at Mylae off the northern Sicilian coast, the Carthaginians discovered exactly what that meant when a Roman fleet under the consul Gaius Duilius, carrying a strange new bow-mounted device, captured or sank around 50 of their ships, including the flagship of the Carthaginian commander Hannibal Gisco, a massive 7-banked vessel that had once belonged to King Pyrrhus of Epirus. Duilius went home to the first naval triumph in Roman history, a commemorative column studded with the bronze rams of captured ships erected in the Forum, and the lifetime honor of being escorted home from dinner parties by a torchbearer and a flute player, which tells you how intoxicating this victory was to a people who had never won anything on water. The device that won it had a name that sounded almost like a joke: the Crow. 4 years later, at Ecnomus, Carthage would face it again, at full scale, with the war itself riding on the outcome. So what exactly was this thing? Our fullest ancient description again comes from Polybius in the 22nd chapter of his first book, and modern scholars, notably Chester Starr, H.T.R. Walanda in a dedicated monograph on the Roman boarding bridge, and a later detailed analysis published in the Finnish classics journal Arctos, have worked through his text to reconstruct it. The picture that emerges is roughly this. In the bow of the ship stood an upright pole around 24 feet tall and perhaps 10 inches thick. Hinged near its base was a gangway, a bridge of planking about 36 feet long and 4 feet wide, with knee-high railings along its sides. The bridge did not simply hinge up and down. An oblong slot cut into its planking, some 12 feet from the inboard end, fitted around the pole itself, which meant the whole bridge could pivot around the mast like the hand of a clock, swaying through an arc to port or starboard. At rest, the bridge stood raised, hauled up against the pole by a rope and pulley running through a ring at the pole's top, so the whole assembly towered over the bow like a siege engine waiting at a wall. On the underside of the bridge's far end hung the detail that gave the machine its name. A heavy iron spike-shaped, Polybius says, like a pestle, curved like a bird's beak. When an enemy ship came close, whether it was ramming, being rammed, or simply passing from ahead or from either forward quarter, the Roman crew swung the bridge over it and let the rope run. The bridge dropped. 36 feet of timber and iron fell through its arc. The spike punched down through the enemy's deck timbers and held, and in that instant the entire logic of naval warfare inverted. Two ships nailed together do not maneuver. There is no more ramming, no more rowing, no more of the elegant rotating attacks the Carthaginians had spent their lives perfecting. And worse, the very act of attacking is what triggered the trap. Because a ramming run has to close the distance, and the closing distance was the corvus's reach. There is only a wooden corridor, 4 feet wide, and the question of who is better at killing across it. The Romans had an answer to that question. Roman soldiers were, man for man, among the most drilled close-order fighters in the Mediterranean world, products of a system that hammered formation discipline into recruits until holding a line became reflex. An aborting fight across a narrow bridge is nothing but a line fight compressed to its purest form. Legionaries came across the corvus two abreast, the first pair holding their shields ahead, those behind angling shields outward against missiles from the flanks, with more men stacked behind them on the bow, 120 marines to a ship at Ecnomus by Polybius's count, and swept enemy decks whose crews were superb sailors and, by comparison, indifferent infantry, many of them mercenaries with no particular reason to die on a deck for Carthaginian pay. Notice what this really is. It is not a naval weapon at all. It is a siege engine, a drawbridge, the kind of machine you would run against a fortress wall, mounted on a warship and run against a hull. Rome could not beat Carthage at sea, so Rome carried its element with it, one plank at a time, and turned every enemy deck into a breach to be stormed. Keep hold of that image of a siege tower standing in a ship's bow, though, because everything that made the corvus lethal to Carthage, all that weight, close to a ton of timber and iron, standing that high above the waterline and that far forward, was quietly doing something else as well. We will come back to it. By 256 BC, Rome was done fighting for Sicily one port at a time. The new plan was to end the war by striking Carthage at home, landing an army in Africa itself, the same strategy that Agathocles of Syracuse had used to terrify Carthage a generation before, and that Scipio would use to end the next war 50 years later. The two consuls of that year, Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso, took the fleet south along the Sicilian coast to gather the invasion force, and the numbers Polybius gives for what assembled off Cape Ecnomus are staggering. 330 Roman warships plus transports for cavalry and horses, around 350 Carthaginian warships waiting to stop them. Do the arithmetic the way Polybius does, roughly 300 rowers and 120 soldiers to each Roman ship, and the Roman side alone approaches 140,000 men, with the Carthaginian total placed above 150,000. Modern historians treat those figures with caution, as they treat most ancient numbers, and Tips and others have proposed trimming both fleets substantially, but even cut by a third. The two fleets off Ecnomus that day carried more human beings into combat than the fleets at Lepanto in 1571, and by some accountings more than any naval battle before the Age of Steel. And the two sides arranged those men in ways that tell you everything about how each expected to win. The Romans did something no admiral raised at sea would likely have chosen. They formed their fleet like an army. The first and second squadrons, led by the two consuls' flagships side by side at the apex, formed the two faces of a wedge, a triangle of ships pointing at the enemy. Behind the wedge came the third squadron in a line, closing the triangle's base, and this squadron had the worst assignment on the water that day, because its ships were towing the horse transports, tethered to slow, wallowing hulls they could not abandon without abandoning the invasion's cavalry. And behind them came the fourth squadron, the reserve, stretched wider than the line ahead of it, which the Romans, in a perfectly Roman turn of mind, nicknamed the Triarii, the same name given to the veteran last line of a legion on land. The line a legion fell back on only when everything else had failed. A wedge, a baggage train, a reserve, it was a marching column drawn on the sea. The Carthaginian commanders, Hamilcar, who held the center, and Hanno, the same Hanno who had lost Agrigentum and had something to prove, commanding the fastest ships on the seaward wing, read it immediately and built a trap to fit. They stretched their fleet into a single long line, thin in the center, strong and extended on the wings, with the seaward wing angled out into open water and the landward wing hugging the coast. The center's job was not to win. The center's job was to break, on purpose. What followed, as Polybius describes it and as Lazenby's reconstruction of the campaign lays out, was not one battle but three, separated by miles of water, and for a long stretch of the day, Rome was losing two of them. It began when the Roman wedge surged forward and the Carthaginian center gave way before it, backing water, retreating just quickly enough to stay out of reach, a feigned flight executed on a prearranged plan. The two consuls took the bait and pressed the pursuit, and the wedge accelerated away from the third and fourth squadrons, which could not keep pace, chained as they were to the transports and the rear guard. The Roman fleet stretched, and then it snapped into pieces, exactly as Hamilcar intended. On a signal, the fleeing Carthaginian center turned about and threw itself on the pursuing consuls. At the same moment, Hanno's seaward wing swept out and around, curling down on the towing squadron and its helpless transports from the open water side, while the landward wing drove at the Triarii and began pressing them back toward the beach. Where ships pinned against a shore have nowhere left to maneuver and nowhere left to run, and where a fleet dies not by sinking, but by being driven aground and burned. Three separate fights out of sight of each other's details, each command fighting alone. In the center, the trap that had been sprung on the consuls collided with a harder reality, because the moment a Carthaginian captain committed to an attack run, he entered the reach of the corvus. The bridges dropped, the spikes bit, and the finest maneuver squadron in the Carthaginian navy found itself nailed ship to ship with boarding parties of legionaries coming across the planks. Polybius says the Carthaginian crews tried at first to dart in and away, trusting speed, attempting to strike the Roman hulls and sheer off before the bridge could fall, and simply could not. The pivot of the corvus covered too wide an arc. And every angle of approach that could deliver a ram could also receive a crow. The center of Hamilcar's line, the part built to bend without breaking, broke in earnest, and his surviving ships fled. That decision won the day, though the day did not know it yet. Regulus and Vulso now did the unglamorous thing that separates a victory from a disaster. They stopped chasing. Think about what that required. Every incentive of ancient command, glory, prizes, the pursuit instinct that has ruined 100 armies, pointed out to sea after the beaten enemy. The two consular squadrons turned around instead and rode back into the other two battles. Vulso's ships fell on Hanno's wing, which had been mauling the transport squadron, a squadron that had been fighting with its back to its own tow lines and drove it off. Regulus drove at the landward wing, which had the Triarii penned against the coast, but had grown cautious, wary of closing to the killing distance where the bridges lived, content to press and harry from beyond corvus range, and that hesitation cost it everything. Because a wing that would not close could not finish, and a wing that lingered could be caught. Caught between the reserve it had failed to finish and a fresh consular squadron arriving at its rear, the Carthaginian landward wing was enveloped and taken almost whole. By the accounting preserved in our sources, Carthage lost on the order of 30 ships sunk and 64 captured with their crews, against roughly 24 Roman ships sunk and none, not one, captured. The sea lane to Africa stood open. It is worth pausing on why this worked, because Ecnomus is sometimes told as though the corvus were a cheat code, and it was not. It was one component in a system, and the system had 4 parts. The first was the wedge itself, which for all its clumsiness meant that no Roman ship met the enemy alone. Each bow covered the flanks of its neighbors, so the classic Carthaginian oar-shearing attack from the side had to pass through a zone where a bridge could fall on it. And the formation degraded gracefully, even stretched and broken into fragments. Each fragment still fought as a mutually supporting block rather than a scatter of individual hulls. The second was the reserve. The Carthaginian plan actually succeeded. This is the detail worth sitting with. Hamilcar's deception worked completely. The Roman fleet was split into 3 isolated fragments exactly as designed, and it did not matter because Roman doctrine, at sea as on land, always kept the last line and always assumed the plan would half fail. A military culture that budgets for its own mistakes is very hard to beat with a single clever stroke. The third was the boarding fight itself, where the drill culture of the legions turned every grappled deck into a foregone conclusion, because Carthage crewed its ships with hired rowers and mercenary marines, while Rome put citizen soldiers with property and standing at stake on every bow. And the fourth was command discipline at the moment of victory. The decision by 2 winning squadrons to abandon a pursuit, and the glory that came with it, and row back for the transports and the rear guard. Take away any one of the 4 and Ecnomus is likely a Carthaginian victory. Carthage, for its part, fought an intelligent battle with a sound plan against a weapon it had already seen at Mylae 4 years earlier and still had no counter for, and that may be the most sobering lesson in the whole affair. Knowing about the trap and being able to do anything about it are 2 different things. When the trap is bolted to the enemy's hull, and when your entire tactical inheritance, everything your fathers taught you about winning at sea, is precisely the behavior the trap is built to punish. Carthage's expertise was not merely neutralized, it was weaponized against its owners. The aftermath came fast. The consuls landed the army in Africa near the town of Aspis, took it, ravaged the Carthaginian countryside, and carried off thousands of captives from estates that had not seen a hostile soldier in generations. When Vulso returned to Rome with part of the force, Regulus stayed on with perhaps 15,000 infantry, 500 cavalry, and 40 ships, and beat a Carthaginian army in broken hill country at a place called Adis, where Carthage's elephants and cavalry could not deploy. Carthage sued for peace, and Regulus, a hard man at the peak of his fortune, is said to have offered terms so crushing the abandonment of Sicily, tribute, a Carthage stripped of the power to make war at sea, that Carthage chose to keep fighting instead. It was the worst mistake of his life. That winter, among the mercenaries Carthage recruited from Greece came a Spartan officer named Xanthippus, trained in the Spartan drill tradition, who reportedly walked the Carthaginian camp, looked at how its generals had been hugging rough ground, and said aloud that Carthage had been beaten by its own commanders, not by Rome. The next spring, in 255 BC, Xanthippus led the reorganized army onto open plain near the Bagratis River, exactly where Regulus's veterans did not want it. Put close to 100 elephants in a single line across the front and destroyed the Roman army. The elephants crushing and scattering the legionary center while the cavalry, 4,000 against 500, swallowed the wings. Perhaps 2,000 Romans escaped to Aspis. The consul, who had commanded the grandest fleet Rome had ever assembled, was taken prisoner along with about 500 of his men. Later, Roman tradition wrapped his end in one of the most famous legends the Republic ever told about itself. The story that Carthage sent him to Rome on parole to negotiate an exchange, that he stood before the Senate and argued against his own ransom because the prisoners Carthage would get back were worth more than one used-up general, and that he returned to Carthage, keeping his word to die under torture, his eyelids cut away by one lurid version so that he could not sleep, or sealed in a barrel driven through with spikes. Horace built one of his grandest odes around the scene of Regulus pushing away his weeping family to walk back to captivity, and Cicero used him as the textbook case of keeping faith with an enemy. It is a magnificent story, and it is very likely not true, or at least not verifiable. The Oxford Classical Dictionary's entry on Regulus treats the tale of the voluntary return and the death by torment as later embellishment, and some scholars suspect the whole legend was manufactured to whitewash a nastier fact, preserved in other sources, that Regulus's widow tortured 2 Carthaginian prisoners in her custody after his death, a scandal that a myth of Carthaginian cruelty would conveniently justify. The plain fact underneath is probably a captured general who died in captivity. The legend, though, tells you what Ecnomus meant to Rome. The man attached to that victory had to become a myth. And now the debt we owe from earlier in the story comes due, because the corvus was carrying a flaw the whole time, and it was not tactical. Picture again that structure in the bow. A 24-foot pole, a 36-foot bridge of heavy planking, an iron beak, all of it standing high above the waterline of a warship that was already, by design, a narrow, shallow, marginal thing in any real sea, a hull built for speed under oar, with low freeboard and almost no ballast, a vessel that ancient navies beached at night precisely because it could not safely ride out weather. Naval architects would say the corvus wrecked the ship's metacentric stability. All that mass carried high and far forward raised the center of gravity, trimmed the bow down into oncoming waves, and turned every roll in a beam sea into a longer, deeper, more dangerous roll. Scholars who have studied the device, stars analysis among them, have long connected that burden to what happened next. In 255 BC, the fleet returning from Africa with the survivors of Regulus's army, 364 ships by Polybius's count, was caught in a storm off Camarina on the southern Sicilian coast, and the losses defy easy comprehension. Polybius says perhaps 80 ships survived. The rest, well over 250 ships, were destroyed with their crews, which at ancient manning levels means something approaching 100,000 men drowned in a single storm, a figure that, if even close to true, makes Camarina the deadliest maritime disaster in human history. Worse than any battle, worse than any single event at sea before or since. 2 years later, another fleet died in another storm off Cape Ecnomus, 150 ships gone. In a handful of seasons, weather killed more Roman ships and men than Carthage managed in the entire 23 years of the war. And somewhere in that stretch of years, without an announcement, without a recorded debate, the corvus simply vanishes from the historical record. No source tells us the order was given. The device that appears in loving mechanical detail at Mylae and dominates the fighting at Ecnomus is simply absent from the later battles of the war. Absent at Drepana in 249, where a Roman fleet trying to fight the old maneuver battle was annihilated, and absent at the end. Historians have floated alternatives, that Carthaginian captains learned to refuse the engagement, that the bridge was awkward in harbor assaults, but the most widely argued explanation is the plainest one. Rome looked at its drowned fleets and concluded that the bridge was helping to kill more Romans than it killed Carthaginians. By the time Rome won the war's final naval battle at the Aegates Islands in 241 BC, under Gaius Lutatius Catulus with 200 quinqueremes financed by private loans from Roman citizens because the treasury was empty, it did so with stripped-down, well-handled ships and hard-trained crews that outsailed the Carthaginian relief fleet in heavy weather. No crow in the bow, and the bronze rams archaeologists have been raising from that seabed since 2010 are the physical residue of that last corvusless victory. The weapon had done something stranger than winning. It had bought Rome the 15 years it needed to no longer need it. That is the frame worth carrying out of this story. Ecnomus was not a triumph of seamanship. Rome had none to speak of. It was a triumph of refusing the contest as offered. Carthage asked, who is better at sailing? And Rome answered a different question entirely. Who was better at storming a wall, and then built the wall's drawbridge into its own bows and made the answer unavoidable? The Romans themselves understood that something enormous had happened on that water. They minted the memory of their fleets into coinage, the prow of a warship stamped on Roman bronze for generations, and the poet Naevius, who had served in the war himself, made the conflict the subject of the first national epic in the Latin language. Yet today the battle sits in a strange obscurity, overshadowed by names like Cannae and Zama from the later war with Hannibal, even though the fleets off Cape Ecnomus, if the ancient figures are anywhere near the truth, carried more human beings into a single day's fighting than almost any battle before the modern age. Perhaps that is because the victory belongs to no legendary genius, no Hannibal, no Scipio. It belongs to a committee of farmers, a copied hull, a wooden bridge, and an iron spike. Empires are rarely comfortable admitting they were saved by a carpenter's solution. If this kind of story is what you come here for, the overlooked battle, the mechanism behind the miracle, then subscribe to the War Room Files and leave a like so the next one finds you. Because the archive of wars decided by one strange decision runs deeper than most people imagine. And we are nowhere near the bottom of it. I will see you in the next one.